What is the most family secret that you know? Story 1. I have a great aunt who one day just disappeared without a trace. This happened sometime in the 1940s or 1950s, around the Portland area when she was in her mid-20s. She never had any issues with her family, was a bright and cheerful person, and then, out of the blue, she didn't come home from work one day. The family had no idea where she went or why she would leave, so they assumed she had either been kidnapped or had tragically passed away, never to be found. Fast forward 5 years, and her brother is in Chicago on business. He leaves the office one day and sees her casually walking down the street. Stunned, he calls her name to make sure he isn't imagining things. To his shock, she turns around, clearly recognizing him. He stops her and asks, "What on earth happened?" She avoids his questions but eventually invites him to her apartment, promising to explain everything. When they arrive at her place, her brother immediately starts bombarding her with questions. She tells him to give her a moment, saying she needs to go downstairs to a shop across the street to buy some cigarettes because the situation is overwhelming for her. Strangely, he agrees to let her go alone. She never came back. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. Story 2. I come from a very complicated family, so here are a few secrets, and you can decide which one is the most shocking. My Uncle Jeff got intoxicated one night and killed his best friend, but since my grandfather was the police chief, he only received a minimal punishment. Uncle Jeff would exploit his daughters, offering them to random men in exchange for money to fuel his addiction. His wife eventually divorced him and took the girls away. Years later, both daughters became pregnant by their stepfather, who was a preacher. My grandfather passed away from a serious illness, but the family lied and claimed it was cancer to protect his reputation as an honorable citizen. No one ever discusses how he actually contracted the illness. They pretend it didn't happen. The same grandfather used to fabricate stories about my mom, his own daughter, being unfaithful to my dad, thinking it was amusing. He continued, even after he had to pick her up from the hospital, due to the consequences of my dad believing those lies. My grandmother didn't want my uncle to marry a certain girl because he was her favorite child. To ensure the relationship ended, she paid local thugs to scare the girl away by kidnapping and beating her. My sister ran away from home and suffered a horrific assault. Instead of supporting her, the family blamed her for being disobedient. They even made cruel jokes about it for years, though now no one dares to mention it. Story 3. When I was a child, our small 3-person family in East Boston was robbed. Someone broke into our home and took my grandmother's cherished Italian jewelry, which was very valuable to her. I was probably under 10 years old, watching my Italian grandfather as he spoke with the police. He politely declined their help and made a few phone calls after they left. Shortly after, the phone rang and my grandfather answered. He spoke in Italian, a language I didn't yet understand. When he hung up, he gave my grandmother a kiss and went out the door. He had said something when he hung up, a phrase I didn't recognize. As a child, I loved mimicking the dramatic way my family spoke Italian, so I kept repeating the phrase like a parrot. I said, "Blow calipore," over and over until I realized I didn't know what it meant. Curious, I asked my grandmother. She told me it meant lock the door. Years later, my mother explained the story to me. Apparently, a friend of my grandfather's had called to say that 2 men were trying to sell my grandmother's jewelry at a local Italian cafe. The last thing my grandfather said to the men on the phone was a heavily accented version of bloccare la porta, lock the door. I don't know what my grandfather did after that, but he returned about 15 minutes later with all the stolen jewelry. Story 4. My uncle is my father, and my aunt is my mother. My father returned from Vietnam in 1969, deeply traumatized. Whatever he experienced there was devastating for a young man from northern Minnesota. After returning, he became heavily dependent on hero and alcohol. At some point, he met my mom, and amidst a whirlwind of substance abuse and chaos, they got married. Shortly after, my mom became pregnant. From what I've heard, my mom wasn't a heavy user until she met my dad, who introduced her to Hero. Fast forward a little, and their relationship became volatile. One day when I was around 10 months old, during a heated argument in the garage, my father snapped. In a horrifying moment, he picked me up and threw me headfirst onto the concrete floor. The impact was so severe that it not only fractured my skull but dislodged a piece of bone, exposing my brain. My mother, in desperation, hit him with a shovel or something similar. This enraged him, and he went to his car, retrieved a gun, and shot my mom in the face before turning the gun on himself. That was the day I almost died. I spent most of the following year in the hospital. Doctors feared I would have permanent brain damage, but I managed to recover relatively well. I still get headaches along the area where part of my skull was dislodged, and I've faced mental health challenges. Despite everything, I was fortunate to have a great aunt and uncle who adopted me. They raised me as their own, and I've only ever known them as my mom and dad. Story 5. When I was 21, I'm almost 24 now, my oldest sister confided in me that she had been assaulted by a stranger when she was 17. I was shocked, as no one in my large family had ever mentioned this before. My sister is 17 years older than me, and people often say we look like twins. For a class project, I once asked my mom detailed questions about my birth, but she couldn't remember basic details, like who was in the room or the time I was born. My parents are very religious, Southern Baptist, and firmly against abortion. This led me to wonder, could I actually be my sister's child, conceived as a result of her assault, with my grandparents raising me as their own? It seemed plausible since this is something I could see my parents doing to protect my sister. However, I never had the courage to ask her directly, as I didn't want to make her traumatic experience about me. Eventually, I asked my older brother, who was 12 at the time of my birth and currently lives with me. He assured me that I am truly my parents' daughter and his sister. He has no reason to lie to me and would have told me the truth if things were different. While it's not the dramatic story I imagined, I'm relieved to have closure and peace of mind that my existence hasn't caused further trauma to my sister. Thank you for all the advice and encouragement that led me to finally ask the question. Story 6. I guess my childhood is the family secret. Everyone knows my grandma is my mom, but I was actually adopted by her. My biological mom married a man who abused me throughout my early childhood until I was about 5 or 6. When I finally confided in a friend who told their parents, the school got involved. Instead of confronting her husband, my mom accused me of lying and placed me in foster care to protect him from charges. She even filed a restraining order against me until I turned 18. Thankfully, my loving grandmother adopted me, and my family moved across the state. Growing up wasn't easy, especially in school. I remember getting in trouble once, and when they wanted to call my parent, I told them to call my grandma. They were confused because grandma wasn't on file, only mom was. It was uncomfortable trying to explain the situation to the vice principal. It's not something I talk about often, but my grandma, who raised me as her own, is the person I've always considered my real mom. Story 7. There's a rumor in my family that my great-grandma, Gigi, was a black widow. She had 4 husbands, and all of them died under mysterious circumstances. One of her husbands was allegedly stabbed to death by her brother. The official story was that he walked in on the husband attacking her and acted in self-defense. No charges were ever filed against either of them. My grandma, Gigi's daughter, stopped speaking to her when she was 18 in 1950 and didn't reconnect with her even when Gigi passed away in 2014 at the age of 96. That's a long time to go without speaking to your own mother, so something serious must have happened. The family rumor is that my grandma knew for a fact that her dad was killed by Gigi, and she never forgave her. However, my grandma refuses to discuss it, even after Gigi's death. I grew close to Gigi during the last 10 years of her life. She was the sweetest, most stereotypical grandmother most of the time. But occasionally when she got angry, she had this chilling, almost sinister look that made me think the rumors might be true. Story 8. I had a cousin who passed away recently. He was homeless, struggling with addiction to drugs and alcohol. In his final days, he expressed a desire to know what happened to his father. His dad had been an abusive man who beat him severely when he was just 2 years old, prompting my aunt to leave him. They had 4 children together, none of whom had heard from their father in over 40 years. The 3 surviving siblings want nothing to do with their dad or to know anything about him. Despite this, I did some online research and discovered that their father passed away about 10 years ago. He left behind a second family that my cousins know absolutely nothing about. What's even more surprising is that his second family is well off, unlike my cousins who live in poverty. One of the daughters from his second family lives in our community. From her Facebook posts, it seems she attends the same megachurch as one of my surviving cousins. There's a decent chance they know each other, but neither of them would have any idea about the connection. I've decided not to tell them unless I see a situation arise where their kids might start dating each other. Story 9. Growing up, my mom always claimed she was arrested because of my dad. According to her, he smoked a lot of weed and had stashed some in her car, which got her into trouble. My brother and I ended up living with my dad's adoptive parents for 5 years, while both of our biological parents were in jail. I was so young that I didn't question it. I thought my grandparents were my real parents. Recently, my grandparents returned a bunch of my childhood belongings, including some court documents. It turns out my mom wasn't just arrested for drugs. We were taken out of her custody due to abuse. The house was described as borderline unsanitary, with very little food but weeds stored in the fridge. Both my brother and I had numerous bruises. I had a broken rib, and my brother needed treatment for a fractured skull. Despite this, for reasons I can't understand, we were eventually returned to her custody. By then, she had a new boyfriend who also abused us. My brother, who has muscular dystrophy, was treated like an infant by her. She manipulated him into believing her lies, including the idea that our grandparents hated him. My mom will never admit the truth. In her narrative, she's the victim and the heroic single mother doing her best. That's just how narcissists think. Story 10. My mother and I are almost certain that my grandfather fathered a child with his girlfriend while stationed in Europe during World War II. He rarely spoke about the war, but we do know he had a serious relationship while he was overseas. The two of them were deeply in love, and he had promised to send for her after returning to the United States. However, he never followed through. At the time, we didn't think much of it. Heartbreaking as it must have been for her, it seemed like the kind of story that was probably common during that time. But after my grandfather passed away, we found an old photo of the woman while going through his belongings. The note on the back confirmed she was his girlfriend. In the picture, she's pointing to a visibly pregnant belly, smiling brightly. While we can't say for certain, it seems likely that she was pregnant at the time the photo was taken and wasn't trying to hide it. It makes me wonder why my grandfather never sent for her. What might have happened to her? And are there cousins of mine somewhere in Europe that I'll never meet? Story 11. My aunt had a baby when she was a teenager. My uncle helped her deliver it at home. After the baby was born, my uncle stepped out of the room to get something to cut the umbilical cord and tie it off. A few moments later, he heard the baby stop crying and rushed back, only to find the baby had passed away. The baby had been breathing fine and seemed perfectly healthy before he left. Panicked and upset, he shouted at my aunt, "What did you do?" She casually replied that the baby had just stopped breathing. Later, she admitted that she had smothered it. At the time, my aunt was around 15, and my mother, who was about 8 or 9, didn't fully understand what had happened. However, she pieced the story together years later while talking with my uncle. When my grandfather found out, he was furious. He nearly beat my aunt to death and then buried the baby in the backyard. My mother said that despite being a hardened World War II veteran who had seen unimaginable things, my grandfather cried uncontrollably while digging the grave. Sadly, this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the course of her teenage years, my aunt had several other pregnancies. One baby was stillborn, and another she reportedly burned. She passed away some time ago, and while she's no longer here, her actions left a dark legacy. Strangely, despite her past, she became a Methodist preacher later in life. Story 12. My parents recently told me about something shocking my grandfather did to my grandmother in the late 1930s. I always knew my mother had a stillborn sister who was born before her, but I never knew the full story behind it. Apparently, my grandfather didn't want the baby. When my grandmother went into labor, he promised to bring the doctor. Instead, he disappeared, leaving her alone, miles from any help. She endured labor for over 24 hours without assistance. By the time my grandfather returned with the doctor, it was too late. The baby was gone and my grandmother nearly died. Despite this, they stayed together. When my mother was born, my grandmother, fearing a repeat of the same situation, walked herself to the doctor's office to give birth. Learning this explained so much about the dynamic between them that I observed growing up. There's also a dark secret my grandfather shared with my father on his deathbed. It involves something terrible he did during World War II. My father refuses to tell anyone, not even my mother, saying it's something we couldn't handle. Considering my father is willing to discuss the horrific things he did during the Vietnam War, this secret must be unimaginably awful. Story 13. Around the time I was born, my grandfather cheated on my grandmother and had a child with another woman. This secret has been hidden in my family for decades. Now, at 29 years old, I'm one of the few people who know. I found out because I lived with my grandparents for a few years to help them out. One day, my grandfather asked me to set up online banking for him. He wanted to automate payments to someone. I assumed it was for bills, but when I asked who the payments were for, he said, Julia. Confused, I asked what Julia was, thinking it was a company. Without hesitation, he replied, to get back at your nana. I was stunned. Over the next 2 hours, he explained that my grandmother had cheated on him, and he decided to retaliate by cheating on her. That affair resulted in a child, a half-uncle I never knew existed, who is my age. I've tried to get more details about this uncle or how I could find him, but my grandfather won't share more, and even my oldest uncle refuses to talk about it. Still, I think it would be fascinating to meet an uncle my own age. Story 14. When I was 17, my father opened up to me and revealed a shocking secret. He had fathered another child 16 months before I was born, with a woman who wasn't my mother. At the time, my parents had been briefly separated. What was even more surprising was that everyone in my family knew about it, except me. My brother, the child from this relationship, was raised solely by his mother. My dad didn't meet him until he was 13 years old, all while raising me with my mom in what appeared to be a perfectly normal marriage. Even my mom was aware of the situation. She and my dad had come to an agreement. As long as he cut ties with his son and the other woman, they would make their marriage work. My grandparents went to great lengths to keep this secret, even hiding pictures of my brother when we visited for the holidays. Knowing that everyone else was in on this secret was hard to process. I've always felt a sense of guilt for being the child my father chose to stay with. However, over the years, I've been able to form a close relationship with my brother. Thankfully, my dad and brother have also been working on building a solid bond. It's not a perfect situation, but I'm grateful we've found some resolution as a family. Story 15. My dad's sister has always had terrible taste in men. Her first husband, who was the father of her oldest child, was physically abusive. He once broke her arm, though she claimed she fell off a ladder. Her second husband turned out to be far worse. When I was a kid, my mom would get phone calls every couple of weeks from my cousin, who was between 6 and 10 years old at the time, crying while her mom was at work. I didn't know what my mom did about it, but years later, when I was 17 and my cousin was 16, the truth came out. Her stepfather had been assaulting her for years. My parents had found out about a month before I did and took the information to the police. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. My cousin was too scared to speak up, worried that sending her stepdad to jail would hurt her mom emotionally. Not long after, that entire branch of the family moved to the other side of the state, and he was never held accountable. On a slightly brighter note, karma seems to be catching up with him. He's now suffering from poorly managed diabetes and is losing body parts because of it. It's not true justice, but it does feel like a small consolation. Story 16. When I was very young, I was told that my grandfather on my mother's side had passed away from leukemia. I remember my mom flying out to Iowa several times to visit him before he passed. To me, that was the end of the story. Fast forward 18 years, and one day my brother casually asked, "How do you think Grandpa died?" I responded, "Leukemia, of course." He then dropped a bombshell. That's what I always thought too, but according to our much older brother, he actually killed himself. Mom didn't tell us because she wanted to protect us, but apparently he was severely depressed and shot himself. That's why she originally went to Iowa. People were worried about him. I've never had the courage to ask my mom if this is true. I don't want to bring up painful memories or force her to relive that loss. Even if it's not true, I don't want to make her think about his death all over again. Out of curiosity, I've tried searching Iowa death records and his name along with Suick, but I haven't found anything conclusive. I'd like to know the truth, but I don't think I'll ever ask her. If he did take his own life, it's incredibly sad. From what I've heard, he was a brilliant man who had once worked as a space engineer. Story 17. A little over a year ago, my aunt passed away and we attended her funeral. My dad's family is quite large. He had 7 siblings, so there were a lot of relatives there, including cousins and cousins once removed. During the funeral, I was having a serious conversation with one of my cousins when a man in his 50s approached me. He gave off a creepy vibe, and I tried to keep my responses short because I wanted to get away from him. I also noticed that my grandmother was completely ignoring him. Whenever he tried to talk to her, she acted as if he didn't exist. A few days later, I overheard my dad and the same cousin talking, and I learned the truth. This man was the child of my grandmother and my deceased aunt's husband. My grandmother had cheated on my grandfather while he was in jail with her daughter's husband. After the child was born, she gave him up for adoption and has refused to acknowledge him ever since, which explains why she ignored him at the funeral. It's an absolutely wild family secret, and even now, my grandmother denies that it ever happened. Story 18. Here are 3 family stories, each more complicated and shocking than the last. Story 1. The Scummy Cousin. I have a distant cousin, 3rd or 4th removed, who works as a nurse providing in-home care for elderly patients. He helps them with their medicine, daily needs, and general care. At first it sounds noble, but here's where it gets dark. When my great aunt, who is handicapped and bedridden, lost her husband to a heart attack, this cousin was chosen to take care of her at home until a suitable care facility could be arranged. 4 days into his caregiving, he asked her to sign some papers. She stalled and handed them to my mom for advice. My mom, who lives nearby and had been supporting my great aunt during her grieving period, discovered that the papers would have transferred power of attorney to this cousin. Suspicious, my family started connecting the dots. My great-aunt's house was full of prescription medications, everything from aspirin to morphine and opioids. My great-aunt had struggled with addiction for most of her life, and the only likely supplier for her medication was this cousin. It seems he has a habit of caring for older women, some of whom leave behind sizable inheritances, and he has benefited financially from their deaths. Needless to say, we don't talk about that cousin anymore. Story 2, the racist uncle. At my grandfather's funeral, I met some relatives I hadn't seen in years. That's when I discovered I had an uncle I barely knew, and that he was very wealthy. Initially, I thought, great, a rich uncle. But my excitement quickly faded. That evening, I overheard him make a comment along the lines of Germany for the Germans. Turns out he's a full-blown racist. He's also incredibly entitled, with a trophy wife and a lifestyle funded by his success in direct mail advertising, essentially spam. Beyond his offensive views, his behavior at family gatherings is notorious. He's been known to make inappropriate advances toward the women in our family, including married women, and even my grandmother. At one family reunion, his drunken antics led to a fistfight with another uncle. His behavior became so embarrassing that he was banned from family events for years. Now I know why no one talks about him. Story 3, a tragic love story. My great-aunt, the one from Story 1, passed away peacefully in her sleep, years after my uncle had passed from a heart attack. After her funeral, I made a comment about how sad it was that they never had children. My uncle had cared for her through 20-plus years of illness, always honoring his vow to stay by her side. I even joked to my mom, they must have had something really special to keep him there. Wink, wink, right, Mom? To my surprise, my mom revealed a heartbreaking truth. My uncle and aunt never had a sexual relationship. When my aunt was 15, she was assaulted. Back then, this unfairly labeled her as a disreputable woman, and people assumed she'd never marry. But my uncle didn't care. He loved her and married her anyway. They were progressive for their time. She was one of the first women in the neighborhood to get a job, and they built a life together. About a decade into their marriage, she became ill, eventually becoming bedridden for over 20 years. She developed an addiction to medication, and my uncle enabled her, doing whatever it took to make her happy. Despite everything, they were deeply in love. My mom suspects they had an agreement. He cared for her without complaint, but occasionally visited brothels to meet his own needs. It's not what I imagined for my 65-year-old uncle, but their story is a mix of tragedy, resilience, and love. Story 19. My aunt has always been the odd one in the family. She has tan skin, jet black hair, and is rail thin. Growing up, her siblings would tease her, joking that she was adopted or found somewhere. Typical cruel things kids say. We were told she resembled a distant relative, which seemed plausible at the time. When she was about 40, the truth finally came out during one of my grandfather's attempts to reconnect with the family after disappearing to Florida for a few years. It turns out my grandparents used to be swingers, and my aunt is the product of my grandmother's relationship with another man. This revelation also explained why my grandparents divorced. My grandmother's pregnancy with this other man was the breaking point. As if that weren't enough drama, the reason my grandfather and his brother never speak, and why I've never met my great-uncle, is that my grandfather had an affair with his brother's wife. So the big family secret. My grandfather was a serial philanderer who may have coerced my grandmother into the swinging lifestyle. It's a tangled web, and to this day, it's the scandal no one talks about openly. Story 20. My disowned aunt did something unforgivable to my great-grandfather when he was in the hospital recovering from a knee replacement. He was suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, often confusing family members for one another. For instance, he sometimes thought my father was my grandfather, who had passed away 15 years earlier, or mistook my aunt for my grandmother. Taking advantage of his confusion, my aunt, who was a nurse at the hospital, had him sign paperwork that he believed was related to his hospital stay. In reality, it was a power of attorney document that gave her full control over his assets. She wasted no time, immediately draining everything he had. Had she not done this, the entire family would have received a significant inheritance when he passed away 5 years later. Instead, she kept everything for herself. I was just a kid when it all happened, so I don't know all the details of the fallout. However, I do know that no one else in the family saw a single dime. My aunt was disowned, and she remains estranged to this day. Story 21. About 3 years ago, my mother did something so horrible that I still get angry just thinking about it. We were at a family picnic, and my mom would give my 5-year-old son food and water whenever he went inside and asked for it. However, my nonverbal 2-year-old daughter was completely ignored. It took us hours to realize what was happening, and it was my son who finally clued us in. He asked why his little sister wasn't getting any food or water. I couldn't fathom someone denying a 2-year-old water, but when I confronted my mom, her response left me stunned. She told my wife and me that our daughter didn't deserve it because she wasn't the firstborn. I was furious and ready to physically confront her, but my dad intervened, verbally defending her actions. By the time we realized what had happened, my daughter was so severely dehydrated that we had to force liquids into her. She ended up in the hospital needing IV fluids, which, if you've ever dealt with a toddler in that situation, is heartbreaking to witness. Since that day, we've only spoken to my parents twice, both at funerals, and they have not seen my children again. My mom once tried to come to our house, but I told her that if she ever tried to contact my kids again, I would call the police. I made it clear she wasn't welcome in our lives. One day, when my kids are old enough to make their own decisions, they might choose to reconnect with their grandparents. Until then, it's my job to protect them and keep that toxic behavior far away from our family. Even now, recounting this story makes my blood boil. Story 22. This isn't as shocking as some other stories, but it's something I've never felt comfortable sharing with people close to me. Here goes. My mom's mother had a habit of stealing whatever she could fit into her purse. This is why she rarely visited our house. When she did, my mom would confiscate her bag and sweater to prevent her from taking anything. It's also why one of my parents always went back into restaurants with her while the rest of us waited in the car. Later, it was explained to me that this behavior likely stemmed from her experiences during the Great Depression. My mom's brother once partially burned down their family home to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. His plan worked. Later in life, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and placed in a specialized care facility. Whether it was karma or coincidence, I'm not sure. There's also a suspicion that my mom and aunt might have had schizophrenia as well, though it was never confirmed. My mom had been married twice before marrying my father. Her first husband was arrested alongside her for smuggling drugs across the border. She avoided jail time but was given probation and was ordered to sever all contact with him. Her second husband was abusive and kept her around only to care for his children. She eventually left him for her own safety. After my mom passed away, we discovered she had kept in contact with her second husband's children. Among her belongings, we found their high school and college graduation photos, as well as pictures of their kids who considered her a grandmother. Sadly, we didn't find this out until months after her funeral. We suspect they may have called her a few times afterward, as there were several hang-ups on her answering machine. My mom also hid our baby pictures because we chose to live with our dad after the divorce. She claimed someone had broken into her home and stolen them, but after her death, we found the photos buried in her closet. More recently, we learned that my aunt is doing something similar, holding on to old family photos and the entire family history from their side of the family. These might not seem like huge secrets, but it feels good to get it off my chest. Story 23. My dad is the only one of 6 siblings who moved to the U.S. He's originally from Sicily. Apparently, his older brother has always been envious of him for living the American dream. When I was 4, something happened that I only vaguely remember but will never forget. My parents told me the full story on my 21st birthday. During a family dinner at a restaurant in the Sicilian countryside, there was a dry well outside the building. My sister and I were playing near it when my uncle told his daughter, my cousin, that if she didn't push me into the well, he would punish her severely. Out of fear, she did it. I fell to the bottom, cracking my head open and breaking my right leg. My parents were horrified, but my uncle laughed the entire time. My parents vowed never to speak to him again. Years later, I learned the even darker truth. At the time, my uncle had been abusing his own daughter. She was terrified of him and didn't dare speak up. The fact that he used her to harm me, his niece, simply because he was jealous of my father's success, still shocks me. Who does something so horrible out of spite? It's truly messed up. Story 24. My mother's biological father married my grandmother while he was stationed in Chicago during the 1940s. When my grandmother became pregnant, he abruptly left her and returned home. Determined to confront him, my grandmother took a train to his hometown using the limited information he had shared with her. When she arrived, his sisters met her. They informed her that he was already married with children. To make matters worse, they handed her $800, a substantial sum at the time, and told her to take care of it, implying she should get an abortion. Heartbroken but resolute, my grandmother chose to use the money to return to Chicago and start a new life with my mother. For decades, the secret was that my mother existed at all. A few years ago, I had a cancer scare and signed up for a genetic testing website. Someone reached out claiming we were third cousins, but unsure how we were related. After comparing family names, we discovered we were connected through my mother's biological father. Eventually, we uncovered his identity. He had since passed away but had been a prominent figure in his state, serving as Attorney General for over 20 years. Learning that my mother was his illegitimate child was a bittersweet revelation. While fascinating, it was also clear that this secret could have ruined his career and reputation. Story 25. My family's history is filled with secrets and tragedy. Here are just a few. My mother's first child was given up for adoption after the father abandoned her before the baby was born. She later married a gambling addict and had 2 daughters with him. Unfortunately, he molested both girls for years. After leaving the gambler, my mom married my father. Together, they had me and my brother. My dad was an alcoholic and left us shortly after my younger brother was born. His explanation? My mom was boring. Her version of the story was that she found him passed out in a urinal at a bar after waiting for him for over 30 minutes. Neither of my sister's father nor my own ever paid child support. Perhaps because of this, my mom decided we needed a man in the house and met my stepfather through a matchmaking service. My stepfather was illiterate, unemployed, and off in a way we didn't fully understand as kids. He required bi-weekly injections, smoked 2 packs of cigarettes daily, and was prone to violent outbursts. One day I watched in horror as he strangled my sister until she collapsed, blood pouring from her mouth. I begged my mom to call the police, but she refused, saying she needed someone to look after us while she worked 12-hour days cleaning houses. My stepfather promised never to do it again. Eventually, he had a nervous breakdown and underwent electroshock therapy. When he returned home, the fights between him and my mom resumed. When I turned 18, my mom finally left, disappearing without a word. Left in government housing with my stepfather and brother, we were soon evicted due to under-occupancy. Before moving out, I discovered one of my stepfather's medical records, which listed schizophrenia. It explained so much about his behavior. Around the same time, my grandfather, the only decent father figure I'd ever had, was hospitalized. My stepfather convinced me it wasn't serious, so I went to work instead of visiting. My grandfather passed away that night. When I came home, my stepfather laughed as he broke the news to me. My eldest sister, who had a child with a man who abandoned her, became deeply religious. She forgave her father for molesting her and even let him stay in her house, which she had inherited from our grandfather. One day, her young son found a lighter her father had left on the table and accidentally started a fire that burned the house down. My other sister, the one who was strangled, had 4 children. Tragically, she accidentally rolled onto her newborn in her sleep, suffocating the baby. She initially lied to the family, claiming it was SIDS. Later, she became addicted to drugs, and we had to take her other children away from her. Through all this, my mom continued working under the table while collecting a disability pension for a wrist injury she claimed never healed. These are just a few of the secrets my family has been hiding. Sometimes I think about how much we've endured, and it feels surreal. Story 26. My family has its fair share of drama, and these 2 stories stand out the most. On my mom's side, my mom and her 4 siblings lost both their parents within the same year when they were all very young. My mom was 12 at the time, and her youngest sister, Aunt Jay, was just 10. After years in orphanages and foster care, Aunt Jay married very young at 15 or 16 to a much older man. Unfortunately, this man, whom we'll call Tweaky McGee, turned out to be a meth addict. Tweaky would disappear for days, leaving Aunt Jay and her young child stranded in the middle of nowhere with no money, no transportation, and no food. When he returned, things would often turn violent. My mom described him as the sweetest guy when he was sober, but that wasn't often. Here's where things get scandalous. My mom's brother, Uncle M, was known for his chaotic lifestyle. He once kept roosters for cockfighting and would get angry if anyone called them chickens. One day, M and Tweaky went fishing together, but only M came back alive. Tweaky had apparently drowned. My mom and I are convinced that M killed him, likely because of how Tweaky treated Aunt Jay. On my dad's side, my dad's sister Aunt B was married to a man we'll call Crazy Town. Over the years, Crazy Town began an affair with B's sister Aunt D. Eventually, Aunt B divorced Crazy Town, who then married Aunt D. So now my cousin's aunt is also their stepmother. To make things more awkward, the entire family still gets together for dinner occasionally, and somehow they make it work. I only found out about this mess a year ago, and I'm still baffled. Story 27. This story comes from my grandfather's time in World War II, and it's one of the most haunting family secrets I've ever heard. My grandfather was in command of a mixed unit of black and white soldiers, many of whom were from vastly different backgrounds, white men from the South and black men from urban areas. They were stationed in the Pacific Theater, building a road through the jungle under horrific conditions: heat, disease, insects, and constant attacks from the Japanese. One day, my grandfather came upon a riot. Tensions between the black and white soldiers had been building for some time due to racism and hostility. When he found them, they were literally killing each other. American soldiers in the same unit, fighting each other while the enemy was nearby. He couldn't punish everyone, as the work was vital. Nor could he send the worst offenders home, as that would be seen as a reward. Instead, he made an unimaginable decision. He executed the leader of the white men publicly. The death was recorded as in combat, likely so the soldier's family could receive death benefits. After that, tensions remained, but the black soldiers knew they could report issues to their commanders without fear of retaliation. There was never another riot in the unit. This decision haunted my grandfather for the rest of his life. Story 28. My mom grew up in a large family in a rough area of the San Francisco Bay Area. Their last name was infamous in the region, associated with carjackings, gang violence, and other criminal activity. When my mom was around 3 years old, her older brothers, who were in their 20s, began sneaking into her room and assaulting her. This went on for years until she was 8, when she confided in her 5-year-old brother. Another brother, who had never taken part in the abuse, overheard and told their mother, my grandmother. One of the abusers went to prison, and the other committed suicide a few years later. When the latter passed away, my grandmother blamed my mom, saying, "He would still be alive if you hadn't opened your legs." Despite everything she endured, my mom became one of the strongest, most compassionate people I know. She put herself through college, raised a family, and broke the cycle of violence. None of her children have gone to prison or fallen into the same destructive patterns as her family. To this day, I don't know how she managed to become the loving, kind, and sane person she is. I often tell her she should write a book about her life because her resilience is truly inspiring. Story 29. There are a few secrets in my family, but the most shocking one is something we never talk about. None of my relatives know about it, only my father and I. My mother likely denied it or pushed it out of her mind, assuming she ever realized it in the first place. The truth is, my brother likely had feelings for me that went beyond a sibling bond. As far as I know, he never acted on these feelings, but looking back, the signs were there. At the time, I was an oblivious middle schooler and had no idea. When I was in 8th grade, he called home, told us not to look for him, and disappeared from our lives forever. His disappearance was presumed to be a suic, but no body was ever found. There's always been the possibility that he's still out there somewhere. My father feared that one day, my brother might return while no one else was home, and either harm me or take me away with him. But he never came back, likely because he's no longer alive. Despite my father's fears, I don't believe my brother would have hurt me. He carried those feelings for years and never acted on them, always treating me with kindness. However, it's been almost 8 years since he vanished, and if he is still alive, he could be a completely different person now. I know that if I ever see him again, I will need to be cautious. Story 30. My family is pretty open about its history. Coming from poverty, we reflect on the past to avoid repeating mistakes. One story my grandfather often shares is about a Civil War-era ancestor who killed a man over a pair of boots and had to flee to the plains. That same ancestor later bit a prostitute during a fight, went insane, and pointed a rifle at his daughter-in-law during a brutal Minnesota winter. The family left him on the porch to freeze to death. Stories like that, involving people long gone, are fair game. What bothers me are the stories about living family members. For example, my grandmother was fiercely protective of me growing up, to a degree that sometimes seemed unreasonable. I recently learned her intensity stemmed from her own traumatic past. Her alcoholic father had raped and beaten her. She carried those scars while trying to shield the rest of us from similar harm. Other family quirks are less intense but still unsettling. For instance, during family reunions, we deliberately leave certain valuables at home. Why? Because several relatives are high-functioning drug addicts who might steal and pawn those items. It's an unspoken rule, and no one questions it. Our family also has a significant number of felons. Most have done their time and become functioning members of society, but it's a secret we keep. Society often treats felons as less than human, and revealing the truth could lead to ostracization. Despite the dysfunction, I've learned to accept that my family's history is a mix of resilience and tragedy. Explaining it to others, though, is a different challenge. Story 31. About 5 years ago, my cousin Jane was reunited with the daughter she had given up for adoption 25 years earlier, Sarah. Sarah was warmly welcomed into the family and became especially close with Jane's other daughter, Beth. Tragically, a few years later, Sarah was diagnosed with leukemia and passed away at the age of 29. Jane was devastated, but Beth was particularly heartbroken, having lost both a sister and her best friend. After Sarah's funeral, Beth and I were drinking, and I started thinking out loud. I questioned why Jane gave up Sarah for adoption when Beth was already 2 years old. Jane had been living with her wealthy parents at the time, so it didn't make sense to me that a second child would be too much. That's when Beth revealed the truth. Sarah was the result of Jane being raped by her father, Dickbag. Jane had confided in her mother, who immediately packed up what they could carry and fled with Jane and Sarah, moving from Canada to the U.S. They lived out of a car for a while before starting a new life. Sarah was adopted by a loving family that had desperately wanted a daughter. Despite her short life, she was deeply loved and cared for. Beth is doing well now. She's divorced but raising a small family of her own, who all miss their Aunt Sarah. Jane has also found happiness, marrying a man who adopted both her children and providing a stable life for her family. Knowing Jane my whole life, I had no idea she had endured something so horrific. Her strength is inspiring, and her story is a testament to survival and resilience. Story 32. Growing up, I was forbidden from going into our basement where my grandpa spent most of his time. I was never clearly told why, other than that I wasn't supposed to. As far as I knew, everyone had a basement that was out of bounds. As I grew older, I began to notice people coming and going late at night from the basement, usually older men with heavy accents. One night I was woken by loud cheering and shouting from the basement. This was pretty normal, but that night it was much louder. I got up to investigate, and upon opening the hallway door, I saw at least a dozen men, all 60 plus, reeking of whiskey and cigars, walking out of the basement carrying my grandpa and cheering. I'd never seen him so happy. The next morning, when I questioned my parents about it, they denied hearing anything. When I insisted I was sure of what I saw, they changed their story, saying, "Grandpa had some friends from the bowling club over last night." This continued for years, until my grandpa fell ill with asbestosis and eventually passed away. After his death, I occasionally heard the basement door quietly open and close late at night. One night, I caught my dad coming out of the basement at 4 a.m. I assumed he missed Grandpa and was spending time there for nostalgia. One day, when I was 14 and homesick from school, I decided to go see what was in the basement. The first thing I saw were 3 very old blackboards covered in chalk markings, tables with 2 columns and multiple rows. Each row had names of men, and each column had timings. I recognized some of the names as people I grew up knowing. The room was dusty and dark, but had a bar with stools and a desk with a computer at the end. That evening, I confronted my dad. He poured himself a drink and explained everything. My grandpa had seen a news program about violent video games years ago and became fascinated with gaming. He bought a computer and the latest game at the time, Duke Nukem. He showed it to his friends who also became hooked. They started racing each other in time speedruns, which evolved into weekly competitions with prizes, usually alcohol. Over the years, it became a secret underground club, complete with large bets and recorded tournaments. Judging by old folders and tournament records, many people participated, with some bets reaching over $1,000. The level times they achieved were insanely impressive. To this day, my dad and I still fire up the old computer, pour a drink, and play a few levels when I visit. Story 33. There's a joke the uncles only tell when they're drunk. Half the joke is the noise they make, a long rasping sound like someone clearing their throat. Every family event ends the same way. The uncles take their chairs out to the orchard, far enough so no one can see them in the dark. While the aunts wash dishes and the cousins run wild, the uncles drink and laugh, making that strange sound, shoo-rook. Even in the dark, you know one of them is gesturing with a hand swiping sideways through the air. The cousins mimic it, shouting, shoo-rook, and falling over laughing. The aunts shake their heads at the silliness, calling it men's humor. For years, it's been the family's secret password. A noise that means, don't take life too seriously. When I was 18, an uncle finally told me the story. It wasn't funny. During the war, the uncles were captured and sent to a labor camp. Every day, they worked under the command of a cruel officer who was both feared and hated. He often singled out prisoners, forcing them into humiliating and horrifying acts. One day, this officer made a mistake. An act of cruelty backfired. In a moment of violence and chaos, the officer accidentally caused his own downfall. For the uncles, that moment became a symbol. No matter how dark or terrifying life gets, sometimes fate intervenes in unexpected ways. They came home from the war, carrying that sound as a reminder of survival and hope. To this day, Shuruk is their family's way of laughing at life's absurdities, a secret code that says, terrible things happen, but sometimes those terrible things save you. Story 34. After my grandfather and great-aunt, his sister, passed away, a trove of documents and information surfaced, revealing a shocking family secret. My grandfather was actually born under a completely different name, and the man we believed to be his father wasn't his biological father at all. Even my grandmother, who had been married to him for over 40 years, had no idea. It turned out that my great-grandmother had an affair with a married man from out of town and had my grandfather as a result. When the affair came to light, the man tragically ended his own life. Following this, my great-grandmother married another man, whom everyone had always assumed was my great-grandfather. It's unclear whether my great-aunt was his biological daughter, but he was known to be abusive, which added more complexity to the story. To top it off, we discovered that my actual great-grandfather had legitimate sons elsewhere in the country. These great-uncles, understandably, want nothing to do with our side of the family. Story 35. My grandfather on my dad's side passed away from a massive heart attack at the young age of 40 when my dad was around 10 or 12 years old. After the funeral, my grandmother started seeing a man named Mitch, whom my dad and his siblings absolutely hated. Growing up, I'd hear occasional references to Mitch, but when I was older, I asked my mom about him. My dad rarely talks about his past, so my mom filled me in. Mitch, it turns out, was a male gigolo who eventually married my grandmother. Over the years, he spent all her money and forced her to file for bankruptcy multiple times. 3, almost 4. Mitch was also abusive to my dad and his siblings. By the time my dad was 17 or 18, he'd had enough. My great-aunt loves to tell the story of how my dad chased Mitch through the house with a baseball bat, forcing him to hide under a bed. Eventually, my grandmother annulled the marriage and managed to revert to her previous last name so she could resume receiving military benefits from her first husband. Story 36. Paternal side. My grandpa was a Vietnam vet who went missing in action for several weeks. No one knows exactly what happened during that time, but when he returned, he was a changed man. He became a heavy drinker and often passed out in ditches near the local bar. My dad and his brothers would have to go out looking for him. One night, my grandpa woke up from a nightmare and realized he was choking my grandma. My dad had a strained relationship with his father due to incidents like this, but much of his behavior seemed to stem from undiagnosed PTSD. Maternal side. My mom was conceived out of wedlock, which was a scandal in the 1950s and effectively ruined my grandparents' lives. They were very poor and unhappy together. Despite their struggles, another pregnancy came along. Knowing they couldn't afford another child, my grandmother sought an illegal abortion. Grandma had gone so far as to hitch up her skirt when she realized she couldn't go through with it. That baby turned out to be my aunt, one of the sweetest and most genuine people I know. There's also a rumor that my maternal grandfather's father performed abortions in the back room of a bar after the war. I doubt it's true, but I'd like to ask my grandfather about it. Unfortunately, my mom has sworn me to secrecy. Story 37. I wouldn't say any of our family secrets are especially dark, but we've uncovered quite a few interesting ones over the years, mostly about my great-grandma. One of the more bizarre secrets involved the children she had with another man. It turns out my great-grandpa was actually her third husband, and only 2 of her children were his. The other 5 children were with her second husband. To avoid suspicion, she made my great-grandpa go by the name William, so that people would think her son Billy was named after him. At the time, the kids were so young that they mostly forgot about their biological father. The exception was the eldest daughter, who tragically died at a young age. There were rumors that her doctor husband murdered her by injecting her with an air embolism, but it was never proven. Strangely, my grandma didn't even realize this woman was her sister at first. The truth about great-grandma's children came to light when Uncle Billy tried to join the military and needed his birth records. Around that time, the family also discovered that some of them hadn't even been using their real names. Great-grandma had a real talent for keeping secrets and bending the truth. When I was 17 or 18, we learned she'd had 2 other children, twins, who died as babies. We discovered this after someone found old records following her death. There was also mention of a 3rd baby, but we have no idea of its name or if there were others we don't yet know about. Unfortunately, by the time most of these revelations surfaced, great-grandma had severe dementia and couldn't explain much of her past. Before she passed, she admitted to having many skeletons in the closet, but she never elaborated. I'm torn between hoping we've uncovered everything and being curious about what other secrets might still be out there. Soon, I'll be receiving documents and stories from a cousin of my grandmother's, and I'm eager to piece together more of our family history. I'm particularly interested in my great-grandpa's side, but most of their records were lost when his grandparents immigrated from Ireland during the famine. There's definitely more to uncover, and I'm excited to dig deeper. Story 38. I have a friend, let's call him Tom, who has an older brother named Jay. Jay works on a ship, so he's away for long stretches of time, typically 6-9 months. Jay is married to a woman, Kate, and they have 2 boys. The boys look identical but aren't twins. Jay is small and short, whereas Tom is big, muscular, and darker-skinned. Kate lives in Jay's parental house, which is also Tom's home. When Kate became pregnant with their 3rd child, rumors started circulating that the baby might not be Jay's. When the child was born, he was much bigger and darker-skinned than his older brothers. Some gossips pointed to Tom as the father, but I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. One day, while talking to my cousin, who lives near Tom's house, we saw Jay's youngest son, who was about 7 years old, passing by. We called him over and casually asked, "Where's your Uncle Tom?" The boy responded, "I don't know, but I saw Uncle Tom kiss and hug Mom last night." My cousin and I just exchanged looks, our suspicions quietly confirmed. A few months later, Jay returned from his contract on the ship, and chaos erupted at their house. There was shouting, breaking glass, and everything came to a head. Jay had discovered the affair between Tom and Kate. I left our hometown for a few years, but when I returned, I learned from my cousin that Tom and Kate now have 2 children together, a girl who is also big and darker-skinned. Kate has a total of 4 kids, 2 from Jay and 2 from Tom. Jay hasn't returned to our hometown after his contract since. Story 39. My aunt was in a long-term relationship for over 10 years. But a few years ago, she broke off her engagement and decided to try online dating. She met a man online, and they developed a long-distance relationship. He didn't have a webcam, so while they messaged each other, he'd watch her on hers, even while she fell asleep. Eventually, my aunt convinced him to talk on the phone. She was shocked when the voice on the other end was a woman. The woman explained that her dead brother's soul was inhabiting her body, and that was the man my aunt had fallen in love with. Despite this bizarre revelation, my aunt drove from Vermont to Arizona to meet her. She brought the woman back to live with her and her 3 children. That's when things got really strange. The woman would leave bundles of sage outside my cousin's doors to ward off bad spirits. She convinced my aunt to sell most of her possessions. She even claimed that spirits had pushed her down the stairs, which resulted in her breaking her arm. For some reason, my aunt entered into a civil union with this woman. A few months later, the woman attempted to kidnap my aunt's youngest son and take him back to a cult in Arizona. Thankfully, she was caught before succeeding, and my aunt got her son back. However, by that point, the woman had drained my aunt's and my grandparents' bank accounts. The civil union was annulled, and my aunt has never seen or heard from the woman again. Story 40. There's a disturbing story about the Kennedy family that highlights just how far they went to protect their image. While giving birth to her daughter, Mrs. Kennedy was instructed not to push until the OBGYN arrived, as he wouldn't get paid otherwise. A nurse was ordered to hold the baby's head in place for hours until the doctor arrived. By the time the baby was delivered, she had suffered severe oxygen deprivation, resulting in developmental disabilities. The Kennedys hushed this up as they didn't want the child's condition to embarrass them. As the girl grew older, they faced a new concern. What if she became pregnant? Mr. Kennedy decided on a horrifying solution, a lobotomy. Without consulting the rest of the family, he approved the procedure. At the time, lobotomy techniques were still experimental, and the doctor performing it made multiple incisions in the girl's brain. This left her unable to speak or function independently. She was then sent to an institution for the rest of her life, while the family told her siblings she had moved to the Midwest to teach and wanted privacy. Story 41. There's a strong suspicion in my family that my grandmother and her lover poisoned my grandfather. She had been having an affair with a successful businessman for about a year. One night, she took all my aunts and uncles to the movies. Afterward, she told them to stay in the car while she went into the house. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and my grandfather was taken away. She requested that no autopsy be performed, and his death was ruled a massive heart attack, despite the fact that he was only 35 and in excellent health. My grandfather was a wealthy scientist who worked for NASA, taught at MIT, and held several patents. After his death, all his wealth went to my grandmother. She immediately invested the money into one of her lover's businesses. However, it turned out he wasn't a legitimate businessman. He was a con artist. He disappeared with all the money, leaving her penniless. As my aunts and uncles grew older and began piecing things together, they all cut ties with my grandmother, suspecting her involvement in their father's death. The only exception is my mom, who remains suspicious but believes that my grandmother, now very old, needs to be surrounded by her family in her final years. Story 42. Everyone in my family believes my father died of a heart attack while on a business trip, but I suspect he was the victim of foul play. I was the only family member who traveled to the town where he died to speak with the authorities and bring back his body for cremation. Before his death, my father had been working on business deals with some associates and had told me he was expecting a substantial sum of money soon. After his death, that money never materialized, and his so-called friends, his business associates and supposed family friends, completely disappeared from our lives. When I saw my father's body, there were signs of a struggle that didn't align with the official cause of death. However, I knew I wouldn't get any cooperation from the local authorities. His business associates were powerful in that town, and I lacked the evidence to challenge them. With no support and the realization that further investigation would only create more trouble, I agreed to register his death as cardiac arrest, cremate him, and let the matter rest. My mother, brother, and other relatives have no idea about any of this. I've decided to carry this secret to my grave, as revealing it would only cause unnecessary grief. Story 43. When I turned 16, my father sat me down to share what he called the big family secret. I thought it was going to be a joke, but he was dead serious. He told me the reason I rarely saw my grandfather was because he had been part of the Russian mob back in Moscow. My father claimed that, while my grandfather had done bad things, he was still a good person, and that we were safe. I didn't believe him until he showed me a photo of my grandfather smoking with a group of Russian mobsters. Then he dropped an even bigger bombshell about my maternal grandmother. She was originally from Shanghai and had been married before meeting my grandfather. Her first husband was involved in a criminal organization in Shanghai. My grandmother had an affair with my English grandfather, resulting in my mother's birth. The scandal didn't end there. When my maternal grandmother's husband discovered the affair, the couple agreed to keep the child, my mother, but split up. My parents eventually met at a boarding school in Germany and got engaged while attending college in England. But when my maternal grandfather met my paternal grandfather, things took a deadly turn. The two men had a history as rival arms dealers in the 1920s, and an argument led to my paternal grandfather having my maternal grandfather killed. My mom, already pregnant with me at the time, broke off the engagement and went her separate way. I was raised by my father, who later married another woman. He casually revealed that the woman I had always believed to be my mother was actually his second wife, a Dutch woman he met while living in Minnesota. My biological mother, who had moved to Brazil, died in a shark attack at the age of 40 during a trip to the Caribbean. The revelation shook me to my core. Eventually, I moved away to Bemidji, Minnesota, to process everything and distance myself from the chaos of my family's past.